He thought he was just rescuing a broken, untrainable dog, until strange barks revealed a secret language only a soldier would recognize. What hidden mission was this forgotten K9 still trying to complete? Interested in the story? Keep on watching and let me know where you are watching from. Sergeant Marcus Hale walked the rows of the shelter with a heavy heart, the heavy scent of bleach and sadness hanging thick in the air, each bark and whimper cutting deeper than the last. Dogs of every size and color pressed against the cage doors, tails wagging, eyes wide, desperate for someone to notice them, to choose them, to save them. He paused at each one, offering a nod, a soft word, but he kept walking, something pulling him further down the dim corridor, past the ones with bright eyes and clean coats, past the ones the volunteers pushed toward him with hopeful smiles. He wasn't here for the easy cases. Not today. His boots scuffed against the concrete as he reached the end of the line, and there, tucked into the shadows of the last kennel, he saw him. A ragged dog, fur patchy and matted, ribs faintly visible under skin stretched too thin, sat rigid and silent, ears pinned back so hard they seemed ready to disappear into his skull. But it was the eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Too sharp, too alert, too painfully aware to belong to something broken beyond repair. They weren't the eyes of an animal that had given up. They were the eyes of a soldier still waiting for orders, still clinging to a code nobody else could see. A small sign dangled from the kennel bars, the edges curled and stained from time and neglect. Untrainable, it read, the letters slapped on in bold, hopeless strokes, as if even the people here had given up trying to understand him. Marcus stared at the sign, then back at the dog, his throat tightening in a way he hadn't felt since the day he packed his duffel for the last time and left the battlefield behind. He knew that feeling too well, the world deciding you're broken without ever asking why. He crouched slowly, careful not to spook him, and held out a hand, palm open. The dog didn't lunge, didn't growl. He simply stared, chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths, as if calculating whether Marcus was worth the risk. Minutes passed like hours, neither of them moving, two battered souls locked in a quiet standoff. Then, with emotion so small it might have been imagined, the dog leaned forward, his nose just barely brushing Marcus's fingers. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was enough. Marcus stood, straightening his back with the old military precision that had never quite left him, and turned toward the shelter staff waiting hesitantly by the door. "I'll take him," he said, his voice low but certain. The clerk blinked in surprise, stumbling over words about waivers and warnings, but Marcus didn't hear them. His decision had been made the second those sharp, haunted eyes met his. He wasn't leaving without him. Some battles weren't fought with guns or orders. Some were fought with stubborn hope and the quiet, unshakable belief that no one is ever truly beyond saving. The drive home was a quiet battle of stolen glances and cautious breathing. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but filled with the heavy weight of two lives trying to relearn trust. The dog, still nameless, still a stranger, sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his body coiled so tight he looked more statue than living thing. Every muscle primed for a fight that hadn't come yet. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, hands loose on the wheel, but he could feel the dog stare, sharp and assessing, waiting for the moment to decide whether to bolt, bite, or surrender. He knew that feeling. He had lived it. Coming back from the field had been like that too, like stepping into a world that moved differently, spoke in a language that no longer fit in his ears. The ones who hadn't seen it firsthand told him to relax, to breathe, to enjoy the quiet. But they didn't understand that silence wasn't safety. It was waiting. It was listening for the next explosion that might never come but felt like it would any second. He glanced over once, catching the dog's rigid profile, and for the briefest moment, Their eyes met. Something flickered there. Something old and raw and painfully familiar. This wasn't a normal dog. This was another soldier, abandoned by the system that trained him, tossed aside when he no longer fit into a neat and tidy world. Marcus shifted gears, the Jeep humming low as they turned off the main road, dust rising behind them in the warm afternoon sun. Home wasn't much. An old cabin tucked against the woods, a few acres of stubborn grass and trees too proud to fall. But it was his. And maybe now, it could be theirs. As they pulled into the driveway, the dog tensed, nose twitching, ears flicking to track every sound, every movement. Marcus cut the engine and sat there a moment, letting the soft buzz of cooling metal fill the space between them. "No one's gonna hurt you here," he said quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to say it anyway. He opened the door slowly, stepping out first, giving the dog time, space, the choice to follow. For a long heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, cautious and deliberate, the dog slid off the seat and onto the gravel, paws hitting the ground with a soft crunch. He didn't bolt. He didn't attack. He simply stood there, head low, watching Marcus with a wary, measuring stare. Marcus reached into the back of the Jeep, grabbing the worn leash the shelter had insisted he take, but he didn't clip it on. Instead, he held it loosely in one hand and started walking toward the porch, not looking back, not calling, just trusting. Behind him, he heard the hesitant scrape of paws against gravel, then the soft, almost reluctant padding of footsteps. Two lost soldiers, broken in ways the world didn't see, taking the first slow steps toward something neither of them dared name yet. The first bark came on the second night, sharp enough to slice through the thin veil of sleep Marcus had managed to wrap around himself. He jolted upright in bed, heart pounding against his ribs like a warning drum, the old instincts roaring awake before his mind could even catch up. In the dim light of the bedroom, his eyes searched the shadows, scanning the door, the windows, every corner where a threat might be hiding. But there was nothing. Only the dog, sitting rigid at the foot of the bed, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the cracked open door. Marcus held his breath, listening, expecting another random bark, maybe a growl, some restless noise. But when it came again, it wasn't random. It wasn't wild, fearful, or the lazy woof of a dog bored and waiting for morning. It was deliberate. 3 sharp barks, a pause, one longer, deeper bark, then 2 quick, urgent bursts. Marcus blinked, the sequence vibrating through his brain, tugging at something so old and buried he almost missed it. It wasn't just noise. It was a rhythm, a pattern. Like footsteps in formation, like the click and hiss of a radio coming alive at 2 in the morning somewhere halfway across the world. He swung his legs out of bed, bare feet hitting the cool wood floor, his mind racing backward through time, through deserts and jungles and static-filled transmissions. The dog sat still, staring at him now, ears forward, tail motionless, not excited, not agitated, waiting, expectant. Marcus crouched low, careful not to spook him, his voice rough with sleep and something else, something closer to awe. "Do it again," he whispered. As if understanding, the dog barked the same pattern once more. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. It hit Marcus like a body blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Morse code. Not perfect, not crisp like a practiced hand tapping on a transmitter, but unmistakable. 3 short. S, 1 long, T, 2 short, I, STI. It didn't spell anything complete, but it didn't have to. The meaning wasn't the point. The message was clear. This dog had been trained. Not in sit, stay, roll over. In something deeper, something far beyond what the shelter had seen. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, heart still thundering, brain flipping through old mission reports, old rumors whispered over campfires, projects that trained canines for communications when human contact was too risky. He had always dismissed them as ghost stories, myths told by old soldiers trying to scare the young ones. But looking into the dog's eyes now, steady and waiting and heartbreakingly human, he realized it wasn't a story. It was real. Something had been buried deep inside this dog, hidden beneath the scars and the fear. And now, after all this time, it was starting to surface. Marcus sat back on his heels, the corners of his mouth lifting in a slow, astonished smile. "Well, buddy," he said softly, "looks like you've got a lot more to say than they thought." Sitting on his porch, coffee cooling untouched by his side, Marcus stared at the dog stretched out at his feet, the morning sun catching in the rough patches of his coat. His mind wasn't on the peaceful hum of the woods or the soft creak of the rocking chair beneath him. It was elsewhere, caught in a loop, replaying the bark over and over, the rhythm scratching at the locked doors of his memory. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. The sequence pulsed through him like an old radio signal breaking through static, faint but persistent. He didn't even realize he was doing it, but his fingers had started drumming the porch railing, the pattern coming back to him in muscle memory he didn't know he still had. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. He froze, hand mid-tap, heart stalling in his chest as realization slammed into him. It wasn't random. It wasn't just noise. It was Morse code. Old, battered, half-remembered, but there, all the same, stitched into the fabric of who he used to be like an invisible scar. Marcus set the coffee aside, mind racing back to dusty comms tents and the low crackle of field radios at 2 a.m., where every beep, every silence, meant the difference between making it out or vanishing into the night. He hadn't thought about Morse in years. It was outdated, obsolete, replaced by satellite links and encrypted networks, a forgotten language of wars past. But here it was, reborn in the throat of a shelter dog the world had labeled untrainable. Ghost, that was what Marcus had started calling him in his mind, lifted his head slightly, one ear tilting in Marcus's direction as if sensing the shift. Marcus leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees, voice low and steady like he was coaxing an old friend out of hiding. "You remember, don't you?" he murmured. "Somewhere in there, you still remember." The dog's tail gave a faint twitch against the porch boards, not wagging, not excited, but acknowledging. Marcus felt something stir deep inside him, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Connection. Not the shallow kind traded in handshakes and polite small talk, but the raw, bone-deep recognition of a fellow soldier carrying wounds too old to bleed anymore. He stood up slowly, careful not to break the fragile moment between them, and crossed into the house, digging through the battered footlocker he hadn't opened since the day he left the service. At the bottom, under faded uniforms and old photographs, he found it, the small laminated Morse code chart he used to keep in his vest pocket. He brought it back outside and set it on the table, the sunlight glinting off the plastic edges. Ghost's eyes locked onto it immediately, and Marcus swore he saw a flicker of something there, something fierce and determined and aching to be understood. Marcus tapped the table gently. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Ghost barked once, sharp and sure. Marcus smiled, a slow, stunned grin breaking across his face. "Yeah," he whispered. "I hear you, buddy. I hear you loud and clear." That night, Marcus sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, the overhead light casting a soft yellow glow across the room, turning the cracked tile into a makeshift war room. Spread out before him was the laminated field radio chart, its edges curled, the print faded from years of dust and memory. It looked out of place beside the stainless steel appliances and coffee-stained countertops, but to Marcus, it felt like coming home. Ghost lay a few feet away, body tense, but eyes locked on him with an intensity that defied anything Marcus had ever seen in a dog. There was no panting, no restless shifting, just stillness, alert, waiting. Marcus tapped his fingers lightly against the floor. 3 quick taps. Pause. Another 3. Ghost's ears perked, his eyes narrowing. Marcus tapped again, this time slower, more deliberate. Dot, dot, dot. Ghost lifted his head, gave one sharp bark, then another, then a third. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he scribbled on the notepad next to him. D. He tapped again. 1 long, 1 short, 1 long. Ghost tilted his head, then barked once. Pause. Another bark. Marcus marked it down. O. His heart thudded against his ribs like a drumline building to something electric. He tapped one final pattern. 2 short, 1 long, 1 short. Ghost shifted, let out a single bark, then stepped forward, tail still low but wagging just slightly, as if unsure whether what he'd said had been heard. Marcus stared at the page in front of him. DOG. His hands began to tremble. It was simple. It was undeniable. Someone had trained this dog for more than obedience. Marcus leaned back against the cabinets, running a hand down his face as the reality settled in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some quirky talent or shelter fluke. Ghost had been taught to speak without words, taught to communicate when sound or silence could mean life or death. The training wasn't civilian, it wasn't cute. It was tactical, precise, military. And Marcus had spent enough time in the dark corners of the world to know that things like this didn't just happen. Someone had spent months, maybe years, teaching this dog to use Morse, and then they let him go. Or worse, tried to bury him like an error no one wanted to own. Marcus looked over at Ghost, who was now sitting, ears relaxed for the first time since they'd left the shelter, tail sweeping the floor in a quiet rhythm. "You're not just a dog," Marcus whispered. "You're a message someone didn't want delivered." Ghost tilted his head again, eyes steady, as if saying, "Then let's deliver it." In that quiet kitchen, with the shadows stretching long across the floor and the past clawing its way back into the present, Marcus understood something vital. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a mission. And they just made first contact. Over the next few days, Marcus became fluent in a language few people even remembered. He stopped watching the news, stopped answering texts, stopped caring about anything outside the 4 walls of that cabin. His world shrank to the quiet rhythm of Ghost's barks and taps, the subtle tilt of his ears, the scratch of his paw against the hardwood floor. They communicated in fragments, in bursts of code Marcus had once used in the field, and never thought he'd need again. Short barks meant yes. A paw raking once across the floor meant no. If Ghost didn't understand something, he would simply stare until Marcus repeated it in code. Together, they worked out names, objects, emotions. The vocabulary of war turned into the bond between man and dog. Every breakthrough brought another layer of awe, and another layer of questions. Who had trained Ghost like this? Why had no one come for him? And more hauntingly, what was he trained to do? Then one night, everything shifted. It was close to midnight, the cabin quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the crickets singing outside. Marcus was rummaging through the fridge, grumbling about expired milk, when Ghost suddenly stood, ears pinned, body rigid. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Not loud, but deep, primal, the kind that started in the bones. Marcus straightened, every muscle tensing, that old soldier's instinct lighting up like a flare. "What is it, boy?" he said quietly, setting the milk down and stepping back. Ghost didn't look at him. He barked, once, twice. Then a sharp pause. Then 4 more barks. Marcus's heart spiked. He grabbed the notepad he kept on the kitchen counter and wrote the sequence down. D. Then he tapped the table softly to ask for confirmation. Ghost barked once. Yes. Another pattern. A bark, pause, another, two more quick. A. Then came the rest, and by the time the last bark echoed through the kitchen, Marcus had it. Danger, his blood ran cold. Ghost wasn't anxious. He was alert. Warning. Marcus killed the lights instantly, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once mapped enemy movements in the dark. He pulled back the curtain just enough to peek through. There, at the end of the drive, half hidden in the trees, sat a dark SUV, headlights off, engine running low. It hadn't been there an hour ago. He watched it in silence. Heart pounding, the Morse message repeating in his mind. Danger. Ghost moved to his side, silent now, tail low but steady, ready. Marcus placed a hand on the dog's head, and Ghost didn't flinch. No panic. No fear. Just purpose. You weren't just trained to speak, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. You were trained to survive. And whatever Ghost's original mission had been, Marcus knew in that moment they were on a new one now, together. The next morning, after a night spent watching the black SUV vanish as quietly as it came, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the adoption folder spread out in front of him like a case file he couldn't ignore any longer. Ghost lay nearby, eyes open, body still, his presence as steady and unnerving as ever. The papers were standard at first glance. Vaccination dates, behavioral assessments, the usual printed forms stamped with signatures from shelter staff who clearly hadn't looked too closely. But as Marcus combed through the details, red flags began to wave in his mind like warning flares. There was no birth date, no intake location, just a vague line that read, transferred from out-of-state facility, and even that was missing a name. No kennel history, no owner surrender, just a blank timeline that stretched too long for any ordinary dog. Then, at the back of the folder, half tucked behind the behavior notes, he found it. A single line, typed in small, tight font at the bottom of a faded document. Property of Project Echo, do not redeploy. Marcus stared at it, heart knocking hard against his ribs, a slow dread curling in his stomach like smoke. Project Echo. The name lit up something buried deep, something he hadn't thought about since his early deployment days. He rose from the table and went straight to the footlocker in his bedroom, digging through the layers of dust and past lives until he found his old hard drive, a backup from his military days. He booted up his laptop, fingers tapping with growing urgency. He searched classified archives he still had access to from his clearance days, the kind most people forgot he kept after retirement. It took hours, but when he found it, he knew. Project Echo, initiated 2009, defunded 2016, classified under Advanced Battlefield Communications. The brief description read like fiction. K9 units. Trained not just for scent, attack, or retrieval, but for covert message transmission in war zones where human contact risked exposure. Dogs embedded with operatives, taught to interpret hand signals, detect silent cues, and when necessary, deliver messages through pre-programmed vocal commands. A contingency for the most silent kind of war. Most of the files were redacted, pages blacked out, names erased. But he found a list. Dog tags with no breeds listed, just numbers. One of them matched the ID on Ghost's adoption chip. Marcus leaned back, pulse hammering, the weight of the truth settling on his shoulders like armor he hadn't worn in years. Ghost wasn't just a dog with skills. He was trained for missions that were never supposed to be remembered. Missions that left no trails. Except one. The one now curled at Marcus's feet, watching him with those same steady eyes, waiting for what came next. Marcus exhaled slowly. They tried to erase you, he murmured, voice thick. But you're still here. And now so am I. The truth was no longer buried. It was sitting in his living room, breathing quietly, ready to finish what someone else started. It wasn't paranoia. Marcus knew the difference. Paranoia was when your mind spun shadows into monsters. This was different. Ghost's warning wasn't abstract. It wasn't a flinch or a nervous whine. It was calculated, repeated, and deadly specific. A black SUV had been idling outside his house for 3 nights now, always parked just past the bend in the dirt road, engine running low, lights off, hidden under the cover of trees. It never stayed more than 15 minutes, never moved too close, but it came at the same hour, just past midnight, when the world was supposed to be asleep. Marcus hadn't noticed the first night, too tired to think clearly, too willing to chalk it up to coincidence. But Ghost had. Ghost had sat up at the window before the engine noise even reached human ears, posture rigid, breath still, as if waiting for something he'd already faced before. The second night, Marcus had seen it for himself. The faint glow of a dashboard, the silhouette of someone behind the wheel, unmoving, watching. And now, on the third night, Marcus stood in the darkness of his living room, lights out, weapon cleaned and ready, staring through a crack in the curtain with the kind of clarity only old soldiers carried. His instincts flared awake with an edge he hadn't felt since the last time bullets cracked overhead. Ghost lay by the door, muscles taut beneath his fur, ears twitching, eyes locked on the window. He didn't bark, didn't move, just waited. Marcus knelt beside him, resting a hand on the thick fur between his shoulder blades. "You were right," he whispered. "You've been right this whole time." His mind started putting the pieces together. Project Echo. A dog too smart for civilian hands. A note that read, "Do not redeploy." Ghost hadn't just been left behind. He'd been buried. Someone had tried to erase him from the books. And now someone knew he was alive, and that Marcus had him. This wasn't some curious stranger or lost tourist pulling off the road. This was surveillance. A quiet pressure. A test to see if Marcus would scare easy. If he'd return the dog. If he'd ask the wrong questions. But they hadn't counted on Marcus being exactly who he was. Someone who'd already survived too much to run now. He moved through the cabin in silence, securing windows, setting old trip alarms along the tree line. Every motion smooth, deliberate, muscle memory carved from years of combat. Ghost followed him, never making a sound, as if falling into step was all he'd ever known. When the SUV pulled away again into the black, Marcus didn't exhale. He didn't relax. He looked down at the dog beside him and nodded once. "We don't wait anymore," he said. "We move first." Ghost blinked slowly, like he already knew. This wasn't over. It hadn't even started yet. Marcus fortified his home with the quiet precision of a man who'd once built safe zones in places where safety was a lie. Every window was double-checked, reinforced with cut plywood he had stored in the shed for storms that rarely came. Motion sensors went up along the tree line, the same ones he'd sworn he'd never need again. But this time, it wasn't about fear. It was about control. It was about being ready. Ghost watched every move with sharp, knowing eyes. Never underfoot, never confused. He seemed to understand the shift, like some part of him had been waiting for Marcus to stop pretending peace was permanent. The cabin changed in small ways. Doors that once stayed open now closed and latched. Lights were dimmed to keep silhouettes off the windows. And every night, Marcus sat by the front door, weapon laid beside him on the floor, coffee. Going cold on the side table, Ghost curled at his feet like a sentinel made of breath and muscle. The bond between them didn't grow with treats or tricks. It didn't need commands barked through clenched teeth or obedience for the sake of order. It grew in silence, in glances exchanged across dark rooms, in the way Ghost would press his head gently against Marcus's knee when he sensed the tension building in his chest. It grew in trust, raw, unspoken, earned through shared stillness and sleepless nights. Marcus started teaching him new words. He tapped patterns on the table, on the floor, short bursts of code that Ghost began responding to with stunning clarity. Within a week, they had built a vocabulary, basic at first, then layered with complexity. Yes became a single bark. No became a soft scratch on the floor. Trouble was a low growl paired with a tail tap. Names, places, emotions, all were slowly translated into their shared language. But Ghost gave something back, too. He taught Marcus how to listen again, not just to sound, but to absence. The creak that didn't belong, the wind that shifted at the wrong hour, the soft silence that warned of something watching, something thinking. Marcus had forgotten how vital that sense was, how sharp it used to be. Ghost sharpened it again, honed it like a blade passed from one soldier to another. On the fourth night, Marcus heard a branch snap in the woods, just one. He didn't move. Ghost didn't flinch. Together, they waited. Nothing came. But that wasn't the point. The point was, they were ready. Marcus looked down at Ghost and gave a slow nod. No words, no command, just understanding. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Two ghosts standing guard, one made of flesh, one made of silence, bound not by a leash but by something far stronger, loyalty born in war, brotherhood sealed in quiet, and the unshakable promise that neither would be left behind again. Under the rising sun, with the black SUV gone and the night's danger faded into memory, Marcus stood barefoot on the dew-slick porch, coffee steaming in one hand, the other resting gently on Ghost's neck. The dog sat tall beside him, chest out, ears forward, scanning the tree line with the quiet discipline of someone who had long since learned that danger doesn't always announce itself. The air was different now, not calm, but cleared, like a storm had passed and left behind a sky scrubbed clean. Marcus scratched Ghost behind the ears, slow and steady, and for the first time in a long time, a genuine smile broke across his face. Not the half-hearted grin he used on polite neighbors, or the hollow one he wore in town. This one came from somewhere deeper, somewhere real. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were soldiers again. Not in uniform, not under orders, but in purpose. The cabin had transformed from a retreat into a forward operating base. Every corner now carried intention. Every moment between them sharpened the sense that they weren't just waiting for the past to find them. They were preparing for the next step. The SUV hadn't returned, but Marcus knew better than to think the silence meant surrender. It was a pause. A recalibration. Whoever was watching had seen enough to know that the man they hoped had softened was still dangerous, still capable, still ready. And with Ghost by his side, he wasn't just capable, he was complete. That morning, Marcus opened a new notebook, the kind he used to carry in the field, and wrote one word at the top of the page in block letters. Objective. Beneath it, he began to sketch everything he and Ghost had learned together. The code sequences, the vocabulary, the emotional cues, even the patterns of movement Ghost had begun to show him during drills they ran in the backwoods. The dog didn't just respond. He anticipated. He led. Ghost wasn't a project to be studied. He was a blueprint. A message left behind by a program that had tried to vanish into the fog of classified files. But Marcus saw it now for what it was. Unfinished work. A mission aborted too soon. He poured fresh coffee, stepped outside, and sat cross-legged in the grass with Ghost lying beside him, eyes half closed but alert. They watched the sun climb through the trees together. "We're not done," Marcus said aloud, not to himself, not as a thought, but as a vow. Ghost thumped his tail once in response. No bark, no theatrics, just agreement. Somewhere out there, someone had tried to bury Ghost's training, to erase the program, to silence the one who'd carried it. But now that silence had been broken. And Marcus, for the first time since folding his uniform and walking off the tarmac, felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, with a new mission, a new partner, and a story that the world wasn't ready to hear, but one they would never forget.